Let me introduce our guest for the evening. Our guest is Robin Gao. Their pronouns are they and he, and they are an outreach educator and outreach advocate at Turning Point of Lehigh Valley, an organization that works to eliminate domestic and intimate partner abuse throughout the area. They do so through empowerment, education, and engagement. Robin is also a published author and has delivered trans education programs at universities and healthcare networks throughout the country. So with that, Robin, I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be able to talk about this topic. So thank you. Awesome. So I'm going to share my screen to get started. All right. 1 second. It looks wonky now, but I promise. There it goes. Very good. Awesome. So again, like totally make sure to ask questions in the chat and such. We'll be checking it. So feel free to pause me at any time. I know this is like a smaller group, so I'm happy to stop and elaborate more on a topic or things like that. So we're going to be talking about domestic and intimate partner abuse in the trans community. I titled the presentation Another Closet because I think that domestic and intimate partner abuse in general is a topic that we don't talk about a lot, but especially I've seen it not be talked about a lot within the queer and trans community. So I wanted to give a space for us to kind of open up this issue, unpack some of the statistics, and then kind of move forward into understanding ways that we can be supporting trans survivors and combating this issue in our communities. So just some guidelines for this session: take care of yourself, take breaks if you need it, ask questions at any time, and then maintain confidentiality. So if somebody's sharing something in the chat that's personal, please feel free to take the things that you learn away from what I'm going to talk about, but don't like share anybody's personal information. I know that most people assume it, but I just think it's good to say, just so people also feel comfortable being vulnerable and talking about whatever they want to talk about, want to bring to the space. And again, take breaks if you need to. There's a lot of information that is pretty heavy. So if you need to step away and come back, we are recording the session, so you can always watch it later if you wanted to watch something, but if it's like upsetting you in the moment. People could be survivors in the audience. So again, just take care of yourself. So our mission is to eliminate domestic and intimate partner abuse in the Lehigh Valley through empowerment, education, and engagement. Turning Point of Lehigh Valley serves Lehigh Valley and then also Northampton County. But there's a lot of domestic violence organizations in every county. So at the end, I'll show you some links to connecting to the one that might be specific to your county if you're not in Lehigh or Northampton. So we provide a lot of different services, and I always just like to kind of go over them just so you know that they're there before I kind of go into the topic. So all of the services are free and confidential. And I go over them also because most domestic violence organizations are similar in this respect, in that they, at least within Pennsylvania, because they're governed by the same entity that helps standardize care for people who are facing domestic and intimate partner abuse. A lot of people don't know that these resources exist. So there's a 24/7 helpline that can connect you to counseling, empowerment groups, even things for children and teens. And then we have a safe housing program as well for people who are in immediate danger. We also provide a transitional housing program from that safe house to help people find safe and stable housing. So these are all things that are available in the area at no cost to people. And then we also want to stress that we support all survivors. And that's part of this work of addressing specific communities, is acknowledging that all people can be survivors. And in fact, a lot of communities of LGBT people are facing domestic violence at higher rates, and we'll kind of go into that a little bit more. So just some objectives for things that I'm going to cover today. We're going to talk about defining domestic and intimate partner abuse. We're going to recognize ways domestic and intimate partner abuse might affect trans individuals, identify warning signs of domestic and intimate partner abuse, recognize barriers trans people are facing when they're seeking services or reporting domestic and intimate partner abuse. And then we're going to identify some strategies and practices for supporting trans survivors. So some of these earlier sections might seem a little bit heavy because we're going to just kind of lay out what the field looks like right now in terms of statistics, patterns, and things like that. And then we're going to move into action. What can we do as community members or allies to support trans survivors? So I have a little thing for the chat too. If you feel comfortable sharing your name and pronouns, you can, but you don't have to. But the question I wanted to ask is, what actions do people do that make you feel loved? I think oftentimes when we're talking about domestic and intimate partner abuse, there's a lot of like focus on the warning signs, which is like super important. It's good to have those conversations, but equally as important is talking about thinking about the ways that you show love and love is shown to you. This provides us with a space of thinking about healthy relationships too. So I'll give people a little chance.
Yeah, so I shared that, I know that in my case with my spouse, she's an amazing listener, which has been good for our relationship. Someone else says following through on promises or agreed upon expectations. That's a good one. That's a very good one.
Yeah, that reliability.
Yeah. I think that's something that people don't think about enough in relationships is how, people crave sort of consistency sometimes, right?
Definitely. And I feel like that connects to the listening too. There is it seems founded in the same idea of honoring and hearing where somebody is and being able to support that. Yeah, I love those answers. So thank you everybody for sharing. We'll keep going, but I want people to keep thinking about that. It's something that I like. It sounds dorky to be like, journal about this, but like, I think it's nice to like write yourself when you recognize that something is making you feel appreciated. It's good to like take a second and be like, oh, that this is a way that people show that they love me in a way that I want to also show that. Cool. All right, so this is another thing where I just want you to think about it. Just how confident do you think you are recognizing the warning signs of an abusive relationship? So we don't have to answer or anything. I just ask people to, if you had like a pin, like where you would put it on this spectrum. And then we'll kind of check in at the end and see if it's moved at the end of all the different things we're going to talk about. So I can't yet. I think I could. I know I can. I personally always feel like I'm a little bit even into the I think I could because relationships are all different. It's a lot about listening, like we were talking about. So lots of room for, I think, anybody to grow and keep learning about what makes relationships healthy. But yeah, just thinking about where you feel like you are on that spectrum. All right, so I'm going to go over some pretty basic definitions just to kind of lay a framework for us to continue from. So domestic and intimate partner abuse, I'm going to kind of give a definition now. So it's a pattern of coercive control used to gain power and control over somebody else. It's a cycle and it generally escalates over time. So both of those elements kind of reinforce that idea of repetition. So there's a pattern, there's a cycle, and we emphasize this in the definition because the way in which domestic and intimate partner abuse works is that it's continuing to increase and constrict that power and control somebody is influencing over someone else. Often it does start with smaller things, and then that cycle is increasing and increasing and increasing and tightening that circle around somebody else. Then I also have it does not discriminate there because people of any gender can be abusers. People of any gender can be survivors. There's oftentimes, I was reading about it in a study that was done about survivors of domestic and intimate partner abuse. There's oftentimes this assumption that like the masculine person in a relationship would be the abuser. But statistically, it's not true, just especially in queer relationships. So just things to know that anybody can be survivors, abusers, any kind of person in that dynamic. What really matters is who's using power and control over somebody else, and how they're using that power and control. And we'll talk more about that as we keep going. So here are just some basic statistics about 1 in every 3 women, 1 in every 4 men, 1 in every 3 teens, and 1 in every 3 LGBT people will be survivors in their lifetime. I'm a little upset that I could not find any statistics on specifically non-binary people, but I'm hoping that someday someone will do some research. The statistics for trans people are that they're about 1 in 2, but some studies suggest even higher amounts of people will be survivors of domestic and intimate partner abuse in their lifetime. And I should have noted that in the presentation, I put trans with an asterisk because a lot of these studies are defining trans very broadly, so also encompassing gender nonconforming people, non-binary people, all different kinds of intersections. I like that broad definition because it kind of brings together a large community of people with shared experiences around gender. But yeah, just it's defined broadly in this study. Oh, I see someone posted in the chat, people of any size as well. Most people imagine the larger person as the abuser. Yeah, that's a really good point too. Yeah, there's a lot of ways in which we are implanting these ideas of like what an abuser looks like or something like that. That's definitely not true, that there's any size of person, any kind of background. Again, it's about who's using that power and control. So yeah, that's a really great comment. Thank you for sharing that. So a question that I get asked a lot in my work is, why do we think these numbers are higher than other groups listed? Oftentimes people are like, oh, so if that group's higher, what does that mean about that group? There's not really any like conclusive evidence as to research that's been done, but I always like to talk about it a little bit in terms of understanding what happens when a group is minoritized or oppressed in society. That usually leads to someone having less tools to getting out of a relationship, having less access to support services. And as we'll continue, I'll talk a little bit more about tactics abusers specifically use against trans people. So I just always like to bring up the question because I've gotten it a lot in presentations. And I always just, sometimes I think when people ask it, it can come off a little victim blamey. So I like to address it to say that like, the numbers generally tend to be higher for communities that are facing more oppression in society. And we know that trans communities are facing that, definitely.
So, and I think it's just important when we're kind of in the space right now is that while that sort of societal oppression is, I won't say it's a root cause of the abuse, but it's a root cause potentially why people stay in an abusive relationship, right? That isn't just limited to people of trans experience or people of minorities. That's often the case across the board, right? Is that, if you're a person, if you're a cisgender person and you're in an abusive relationship, you don't necessarily, often you're so focused on survival that you're not thinking about how do I get out and making that plan. You're just thinking, hour to hour and day to day sometimes.
Definitely. And that's 100% true. Yeah, thank you for adding that. Definitely. So then after that, I also like to bring up there's a myth of mutual abuse that happens, especially when we're talking about LGBTQ relationships. There's this perception that people of the same gender or people who are both trans, they can't be abusing each other because they are on like a level playing field. At least this is what people's perceptions are. And I'm getting this information too from a study that was done in about 2018 by 120 agencies. And the survey showed that they didn't take abuse between people of the same gender or people who are both trans as seriously as heterosexual relationships. So that was just a study that was done that showed that this is a perception that happened. So I always like to bring up the myth of this idea of mutual abuse. That's something that's agencies might say. And I like to just empower people with the knowledge that these biases still persist. And knowing that they exist, we can kind of start to chip away at those kinds of perceptions. A lot of the research that I've gotten has been from two specific books, one on LGBTQ intimate partner abuse and one on specifically trans intimate partner abuse. And before the session is over, I'll also link them because they're really great tools. And I'm glad that somebody compiled that information. So I'm going to kind of go into some more research on trans victims and survivors. Usually I prefer the language of survivors because it's more empowering than to say victim. But I included here because some of these statistics are about like violent crime and like murders. So in instances where someone was a victim of those kinds of crimes. So some of this is heavy, so I just want people to know that going into it. But again, I think that it's important to bring up the problem so that we can start to consider ways to support survivors. So about 14% of intimate partner violence homicides are trans people. And this is significant considering the overall population of trans people. It's disproportionate considering how many trans people there are. It's not reflective of the specific population. It's bigger. It's a bigger piece of the pie than would be expected if everyone were experiencing the same rates of intimate partner violence homicides. About 28% of trans people will postpone medical care for domestic violence incidents, either for fear of facing transphobia in the medical establishment or for fear of opening up dialogue about the domestic violence that's happening. And about 48% could not afford medical care after a domestic violence incident. So reasons why people aren't seeking help after physical violence. And then about 38% of trans people experience harassment by police when reporting domestic and intimate partner abuse. So these are all a lot of systemic issues that intersect with the issue of domestic and intimate partner abuse. These barriers, whether it's in the medical field or when we're talking about here, we're talking about police and the justice system, not always taking trans survivors seriously. Here's a quote from an attorney from the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. She says, "When my clients who are survivors of domestic violence call the police for assistance, they often end up getting arrested either of or along with their abuser. Rather than investigate the situation, police tend to make arrests based on assumptions." So there's a lot of legal barriers at different levels of what's going on here. I've just laid out a lot of kind of heavy things that are going on. So I want to pause to see if anybody has any questions about that research or any just follow-up comments before I kind of move on to a slightly different topic related to the research, but a little bit different.
When you were talking about, I think it was 28% of trans folk who are suffering from abuse will not go to the doctor or seek medical care for injuries or psychological issues. I'm assuming that also includes that as well. After, an incident, right? I mean, that's really indicative of, the bigger problem, right? Which is, discrimination against trans and non-binary and genderqueer folk, period, in the medical establishment, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think so. And that's another reason why I'll talk about it a little bit later, but I would, if you're advocating for survivors, I would always advocate for going with people places, because if you have someone to advocate for you, and domestic violence organizations will sometimes provide this. I know that Turning Point does, that if you're a trans person who's scared of going to the doctor for stuff, we have a medical advocate who is LGBT conscious and is part of the community and would offer that kind of thing. So there are some ways of mitigating this. And I'm hoping as time continues that more organizations will offer that for all survivors. Because like you said earlier, all people face a lot of different levels of discrimination in these settings. So having a kind of advocate there can be really helpful, especially because someone who's being abused, their whole world's been turned upside down. They've been isolated, lots of different things. So having someone to advocate and help in those situations can be super important.
Yeah, and so somebody made a comment in the chat too that these are uncomfortable issues, but they're the truth, right? And people need to see it. People need to hear it, right? Because it's validating for the concerns that people, or the issues that frankly people might be experiencing. Another thing I wanted to just mention is that so we just lost, by our count, I think it was the 38th person of trans experience was murdered this week, unfortunately. And, a lot of times when I'm talking to people, they go like, well, a lot of these people are streetwalkers and, but from, my understanding is that, the better part of half of these people are killed by their partners.
Yeah, and that's 100% true. That's like statistically, most people are killed by their intimate partners. When we're looking at those numbers. Yeah, and that's something that I always want to bring up when people talk about those numbers too, is like, these are people are being harmed or killed by someone who they're usually dating or someone who they loved, not anything else. And not to say that like, it would mean anything different if it was like a different kind of relationship, like a hookup. But I do think that people kind of just assume that all trans relationships would be some sort of hookup, and not like that someone who cares about you would hurt you like that. So yeah, definitely a really good thing to bring up. Awesome. So we'll keep going a little bit. I'm going to go into some statistics that are a little bit less direct about domestic and intimate partner abuse, and a little bit more considering some of the wider issues going on in the trans community and LGBT community in general. So I talked about this a little bit in the beginning, I think, but a study was done of basically trans and LGBT youth in high school. And out of about 400 people interviewed, only about 3 were able to identify role models of healthy LGBT relationships. So I bring this up because I think that it suggests another way, and another thing that we can advocate for is better education for queer youth, whether it's sex education or youth in general, just need more education about what it means to be in a healthy, loving relationship, whether it's romantic or not. Honestly, I think that we don't receive a lot of education about how to love and support each other. And that is super amplified for trans and queer youth who aren't seeing a lot of, just like happy endings in general, or like caring and loving relationships. When I was at an LGBT youth camp, I asked some of them this question about like, where do you see healthy relationships and such? And most people didn't have an answer to. Some people did talk about the show Pose, though, which I do think offers some very beautiful and healthy trans relationships. So I would recommend that. I can't think of many others, though I do think that there is a growing sphere for it. Again, I do think that this suggests that just a need for more education. And that's not to say that this, like, not having a role model ultimately means you'll be in an abusive relationship or something like that. I think it's just what I take from it is the idea that if you're not taught that your love is valuable and that like you're valuable, it can be easier for a abuser to constrict you and to chip away at a self-esteem that's already been kind of not given a good foundation. So that's kind of what I take away from it in that regard. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about specific abuse tactics that people use on the trans community specifically. And then from there, we'll kind of talk about warning signs. We'll keep talking about supporting survivors, and then we'll move on to what we can do to combat those barriers. So just kind of quickly, here are kind of the 6 areas of abuse that we generally talk about in the domestic violence sphere. We talk about physical abuse. And this usually encompasses anything to do with the body. People usually think of this as like punching and hitting, but I always like to explain that it can be anything to do with manipulating your physical body. It can, if somebody's using a mobility device, it could mean taking that away from them. It can mean a push. It can mean all sorts of different stuff. Emotional abuse, this can involve calling people slurs. This can involve calling people bad names, manipulation, blaming, all different kinds of things go into that category too. Then there's sexual abuse. People often just think of this as just strictly rape. Oh, I see someone typed in the chat, so I stopped. Taking your eyeglasses away from you, taking car keys could be physical abuse. Definitely. Yeah, these are all really great points. Those are definitely examples. And I like how you're explaining how physical abuse really does encompass a lot of different things. We don't always think of it as so far reaching, but it is. It's ways of limiting and harming the physical body. So as I was saying, I like sexual abuse. People often think of just rape, but it encompasses anything that's encroaching on people's autonomy sexually. So if somebody doesn't consent to having pictures, like sexual pictures sent to them, if an abuser will sometimes bombard people with sexual pictures that are unwanted. It can involve other unwanted physical touches. So that's something else to consider. Financial abuse, this is manipulating people's access to money. And that can involve, similar to in the chat, similar to taking away keys to a car if somebody's not letting someone go to work to earn money. A lot of times abusers will use that instead of actually taking money to be like, oh, well, I don't want you to work, or I want to limit your access to work. Then digital abuse. This involves social media. This involves messaging, all sorts of stuff like that. An aspect of digital abuse that I've seen a lot for trans youth is through video games. There's been a lot of ways I've seen people hack people's video game passwords, or like abusers who will go to different servers in video games and specifically target trans people, specifically young trans people, because they kind of study up on people's insecurities and use them in that way. So that's another area of the digital sphere where I've seen that happening in my work. And then there's stalking, which is, like kind of both what you think of in like movies or someone following you around, but it also bleeds into the digital sphere. We joke about like Facebook stalking, but oftentimes abusers will use social media to keep tabs on people. So, and I breezed through these kind of quick because I'm going to elaborate on them a little bit later then too. So about 57% of trans people reported experiencing psychological abuse, about 35 reported experiencing physical abuse, 47 reported sexual abuse, and 73% reported experiencing specific abuse that was anti-trans intimate partner violence, so based around some sort of aspect of their trans identity. At this point, I usually like to bring up the power and control wheel, which is a way of visualizing the different ways in which an abuser is maintaining that power and control over someone else. So each of these slices are different tactics that that person is using. My only criticism of this model in general is that I think that, so there's a slice, this is based on the Duluth model. I was a little bit edited because personally I found the Duluth model a little bit binary. Instead of, they usually have like a slice that says like male privilege or something. And I'm like, I don't know if that's true. So I'm gonna change that. And I use that to encompass just privilege because as we know, there's lots of different, frankly, I think more important privileges that people can be leveraging. Also that the idea of male privilege is kind of transphobic. So this is my edit of it to encompass a little bit more of a conscious way of thinking about that. Because people can leverage privilege in different ways. And I think that intersections that we should think about too are like race, economic status. People can leverage those kinds of things. With that in mind though, again, people of all different backgrounds, all different genders can be abusers and survivors, but sometimes privilege is something that people will be leveraging within domestic violence situations. And we'll continue to elaborate on some parts of this. It's just that I do think that the circular visualization is helpful for being like, yes, these are all the different, people aren't just doing one thing. An abuser is using a lot of, like a toolbox basically of abuse in order to constrict that person's life, basically. Awesome. Another visualization I like to show is the cycle of abuse. This just shows how abuse happens in waves. There's usually a honeymoon phase where things are really super good. Then tension builds. There's an explosive phase. This can involve intense physical violence, but also emotional violence or financial abuse. Basically, there's some sort of explosive event. Then usually the abuser will be reconciling with this person, and this process repeats. The cycle isn't, it's all not always the same amount of time. Some people experience a honeymoon phase that's months long. And this is the ways that an abuser will be strategically planning these things in order to maintain that control over somebody. So talking about some warning signs. Some warning signs would be injuries, but what I say about injuries is it's more important to listen to how someone's responding to you asking about an injury. People get injuries all kinds of ways. Usually with domestic violence, there's this image of a black eye that's been repeated a lot. I definitely think that happens with domestic violence, but there's all different kinds of injuries people incur. So if a friend or somebody you know has an injury that they're not talking about, asking in a compassionate way is good, in a way that doesn't make them feel singled out. I will talk a little bit more about those skills in a few slides, but not calling them out in front of a group of people, but permitting them the space to talk about it. Changes in personality and style, changes in activities, isolation, and this is especially common in the queer community. Queer communities, especially, I guess I won't say especially in small areas, but just queer communities in general tend to be pretty close-knit. So oftentimes abusers will try to isolate that person from that network because that's a support network that they would have. Obsessive phone calls, text messages, and emotional distress. The image there is of a person crying, but I think that people present emotional distress in a myriad of ways. People might become really stoic, might have really big mood swings, might get really angry. And this is just because they're processing a traumatic experience. So what I say overall is to pick up on changes that seem kind of drastic in a person and seem to be not maybe feeding people feeling comfortable in themselves, because, you know, queer people experiment with gender presentation all the time, and that's super awesome. But I would say that people can generally tell the difference between that kind of happy exploration of identity and changes that feel a little bit more suppressive, especially when it's linked to like what a partner wants. So some of the unique elements of abuse that are happening in the trans community, there's outing. Partner might threaten to out somebody as trans to family members or people they don't feel comfortable with. So that happens a lot. Withholding hormones or gender affirming articles or such. Yeah, doxing, that's definitely a big one. Sending out that information to all kinds of groups. I've seen people even just like send people's information to like weird forums on the internet and stuff like that. Manipulating gender expression. So trying to influence somebody to dress more masculine or more feminine or something like that. There is something that this one source I was reading, I will have to put it in the link later, about this pattern of acceptance and rejection that happens specifically for trans folk. A partner will be super accepting of someone's transness, then be super rejecting, and then be accepting again. And this is that pattern of giving someone that euphoria of acceptance and then the rejection and like using that back and forth. And a similar pattern can happen with identity abuse. So identity abuse is a category where an abuser is saying you're too trans, or you're not trans enough, or you're too queer, or you're not queer enough. And an abuser will be using that similar to the acceptance and rejection kind of binary, is like moving them between each other to scramble someone's brain kind of and keep them in that control. What about den name or intentionally using wrong pronouns? Where would that fit in? I would consider that a form of emotional psychological abuse. I would also consider it related to just identity abuse in general, to not accepting somebody. I think that this is when you see den naming and pronouns, sometimes people are using this as a way of that acceptance and rejection cycle. Sometimes like an abuser will use the right name and then not, and like keep the person guessing as to why. So that's like a form of manipulation that I've seen used a lot.
I think
So
also where, if you get involved with somebody who is unwilling, I'm an out loud and proud person of trans experience, but if I get involved with somebody who's unwilling to acknowledge that publicly, yeah, that's a real problem, right?
definitely. Yeah, that's super. A thing I've seen a lot, definitely. Um, yeah, and then other elements are fear of just transphobia, in seeking support systems, and fear of losing gender affirming systems if you were to, say, go into a safe housing program or something like that. So sometimes survivors will be scared to, maybe their abuser has their healthcare tied to them, uh, has access to financials, and they're worried that they're going to lose their gender affirming systems because of that. So these are a lot of complex things that are interlocking when it comes to ways in which abusers are harming trans people. And this is just another research by a group led by last name of Wathen, and they analyzed specific impacts of economic impacts. So 69.9% had their impacts to their ability to go to work impeded, and this is all trans people. 69.6% experienced domestic and intimate partner violence in their workplace. So an abuser coming to their workplace, and 95.7% reported that their quality of work was impacted. So this is coming into the workplace too, talking about that piece with the financial abuse. We've seen these numbers are much higher than with cis people or non-LGBT people in general. So I thought I would just bring it up because it's another way in which abusers are trying to impact trans people's ability to have that autonomy. Within this, I always also like to bring up traumatic brain injury because it's really common with domestic and intimate partner abuse. It's disruption to the normal function of the brain. It can be caused by a bump, blow, or jolt to the head, or penetrating head injury. It's very common in domestic and intimate partner abuse, and just about 90% of all injuries from domestic and intimate partner abuse are to the head, neck, and face region. So I bring this up too, so to know that if you're supporting a survivor and they're presenting some symptoms that are similar to a concussion, it might be cause to take them to a doctor. Traumatic brain injury, there's lots of ways to help somebody heal from it, but it might be impacting someone's ability to process information. So if you're noticing that on top of all these traumatic things happening to somebody, they have a sensitivity to light, they're getting headaches. This could be from a blow to the head, and it would also be caused to make sure that they're getting some medical attention for it. We see so much in the news about like concussions from athletes and such, but the domestic violence survivors population doesn't get as much attention. So I always like to bring it up, making sure that people are getting that help.
It's also important to say that, so injuries on visible parts of the body are a way of controlling somebody, right?
Yeah,
so,
definitely.
if you have a black eye, you don't want to go out in public, right? Or, you have
Definitely.
bruises or whatever. It's a mode of control.
Oh, definitely. And then thinking about that impact to brain processing, that hurting somebody's ability to process the information too is definitely another layer to that. So someone has headaches all the time, it's harder for them to, even think about seeking help. I've worked with survivors where their goals take a really long time because they, need that time to process it because they've been injured in that way. I see in the chat, TBI could make them think they're just depressed. Yes, definitely. People often use the injuries and blame themselves. They'll say things like, oh, well, like, this is my fault for being depressed, or like, why am I, or be upset with themselves. It's just understandable being frustrated with barriers you're facing. But like, this is my fault for not being able to work through this, or like, push through this when like your brain needs time to heal. So that's a good point too, definitely. This TBI can also cause really big mood swings too, and people often blame themselves for that as well. Yeah. So just some additional barriers. These are quotes from survivors I've worked with. Just, I'm scared of losing my community. I'm scared they'll trust my partner over me. They won't understand my identity when talking about seeking services. They'll just think I'm crazy. And I think that people tend to say this because of what an abuser has told them. This is kind of a form of gaslighting, is making someone feel like they're crazy because you're warping the reality of what's really happening. And then the idea that somebody won't help. So everyone deserves to be in a healthy relationship, and there's no excuse for abuse. I just include these slides, just have a moment to pause and think about it. So I'm going to keep going along because I've always planned a lot to cover, and I want to make sure that we get it in the hour because I know that people have, lots of stuff to do. So gaslighting. I always like to bring this up in a slide because it's used a lot online, and I like to give people like a firm definition of what it means. The term gaslighting came from a movie, which I'm forgetting the title of, but basically a husband in the movie would be turning down the gas lights, but telling his wife that he wasn't actually doing that, and it made her feel like, oh God, like my reality is warped. So this is a small like poem to illustrate the language that a abuser would be using that would be considered gaslighting. So that didn't happen, and if it did, it wasn't that bad, and if it was, it's not a big deal, and if it is, it's not my fault, and if it was, I didn't mean it, and if I did, you deserve it. So these are just different ways of changing the survivor's reality. So saying something didn't happen, minimizing what happened. So an example might even be, we can take a physical injury as an example, punching someone and an abuser might actually say like, oh, you incurred that yourself, you fell. It's a way of warping their reality, or saying telling the person it's not that bad, or that they didn't mean it. So just different ways of changing that reality. Another question I get a lot is why people stay in these relationships. We've touched on this a little bit, but this is just a graphic of a lot of different things that I've just heard talking to survivors, and being a survivor myself. People stay for love, fear, shame, fear of being alone, this idea that things will get better, because this is something that the abuser promotes too in that reconciliation phase. They're telling you this will get better. Immigration status can play into a part too. If the person who is a survivor is undocumented, the person who's abuser is helping them with that process. They might fear being deported for some reason, or whatever reason gets brought up by authorities, financial reasons. We can go over this topic for a long time, but I wanted to give it a moment because it's never an abuser's, and never a survivor's fault for being in an abusive situation. And oftentimes they have reasoning that they need to stay there for certain reasons or need to take their time and leave when it's safe for them. So advocating and uplifting survivors. As I talked about a little bit, people need space to talk about healthy relationships too. So I won't linger on this too long because again, I'm going through these slides, but giving people space to reflect on what healthy relationships means, I think is important. We talk about these red flags in relationships a lot, but I think that we should give a lot of time to talking about green flags, that trust, honesty, independence, and especially within our communities as trans people and LGBT people. Giving space to talk about those healthy relationship qualities, I think, is really healing and community building a lot. So how to help somebody? I think that supporting someone who's a survivor in listening is really important. I like that we brought that up in the beginning. Acknowledging that you're not a rescuer. In my work, we like to say the survivor is always driving the bus. We are just on there to make sure that that person can get there. So we want to be supporting what they need in the moment. And that might mean that people can't leave that situation right away. So understanding that we're not a rescuer is important for maintaining that person's autonomy, because so much has been taken from them in terms of autonomy that it's important that we're empowering and respecting their choices, and providing a non-judgmental space. That doesn't mean we can't share resources. I think that sometimes it's good to give a menu of like, here are some things I'm thinking about that might be able to be helpful. So if we can just take a few quick seconds to answer this. In your opinion, what are your favorite positive qualities of the trans and queer community? And I like to reflect on this because I think that oftentimes in the face of these statistics that are often sad realities, it's a hard reality. Taking a second to think about what's good about the community, those are the areas that we can lean on when combating this issue.
So I think that there's, because so many, queer people have had to deal with trauma of one sort or another, there's a lot of empathy built into our community, but that's not always accompanied by, action or giving options, right? So we do a lot of hugging and putting our arms around each other, but we don't necessarily go a further step, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
So somebody wrote that they love that the queer community accepts them. That's a tough word tonight, even when they change.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that can translate well into supporting survivors, people's changing needs and changing goals, as they're working through this situation and such. So yeah, I just like to think about our strengths and how we can band them together to support survivors. So it's a good point. Awesome. Yeah, I always say, I always think of like love and resilience in our community. So just things that can help support survivors.
And I've never seen a community that has been able, decade after decade after decade to, pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? And, just the generosity is amazing sometimes. So
definitely. So last few things, initiating conversations with somebody. I always like to say phrases like, are you okay? Do you want to talk? I'm here for you are really good. These are all just kind of bubbles of similar ways to phrase that. I've noticed you have bruises. You want to talk? Phrases that open the door as widely as possible because you want to let people define what's happening to them in their own words. And then responding to disclosure, saying things like, I will support your decisions. I care about you. I'm concerned about your safety. This isn't your fault. I think that that's super important. And I believe you. These are all good things to say. And obviously taking it into a larger conversation, but these are just some places to start. We're going to go past the activity in the interest of time. But I think that this is something we can take away from this just conversation, choosing one of the barriers we talked about and brainstorming possible ways to combat that. It's just a good exercise. You never know when these are going to happen in your own community. So it's just a good place to talk about it. I have a few examples too, but we're going to go past them in the interest of time and just talk about some action steps for us to engage in, staying engaged in the movement, following Turning Point on some of our social media things can like help you stay up to date on what we're doing. I really encourage people to create and update a policy in your organization for supporting survivors. Oftentimes, organizations don't have time to think about it until it happens, where there's like there's an abuser and a survivor within the community, or there's a survivor coming into an office space, whether this is a job or a group that you're part of. Just having like a simple policy can be helpful. By policy, I mean like what are the things that we can offer as a group to support this person? How do we want to plan to refer them out to places? Will we accompany them? How will we check in on them? Things like that. Referring organizations for trainings and presentations can help people know that these resources are out there. And then fundraising and donating always helps too, just to keep safe houses running and stuff like that. And then I always challenge people with a tiny brainstorming step because I gave you a bigger one. And this is just to think about ways of opening up conversations about healthy relationships. How can you bring it to your own relationships, whether they're romantic or friendships, or even just conversations in the community? Oh, yeah. So in the chat, in my past, I've appreciated organizations that have well-established exit plans for employees and members. Yeah, that's a really good note. It's great for workplaces and organizations to have pretty detailed plans, safety measures in the organization. I often encourage people to make like a map in terms of like what to do if this happens. It can seem, I think that sometimes people think, oh, that might seem excessive, but then you have a map when the situation does occur. Yeah, and in the chat, it means I don't have to ask for it. Yeah, definitely. Exactly. Having that plan is also just a courtesy to considering the people who might be survivors. And then you don't have to, start from scratch. So definitely.
I mean, I think in general, and this is something that I've noticed a lot, we run 6 different support groups, and I've, in these groups, I see like, a lot of people with trans experience, we are amazing at like, gaming out every possibility of something that could happen. So, as I go through my transition, or if I come out at work, or, this could happen, this could happen, this could happen. And if that happens, I'm going to do X or I'm going to do Y. But we don't necessarily do it around issues like this. And there are important conversations to have sort of in advance, right? To have that game plan. So what would we do if somebody, came to our organization or one of our peer groups and we noticed some of these potential issues or behaviors, and how would we deal with those things?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a good question to just pose to people in a group too. I think that developing these more intense plans can just start with a simple talk of like, how would you respond to that? Because I think that those feelings too are important as well. Like, exploring how people feel about that. And I think that opens important conversations too, definitely. Awesome. So we're coming near the end of everything. Here are some of our social media outlets. We have a Facebook and Instagram and a LinkedIn, and then we have a website. The website is good because it details all of our services. I see, have you seen the bartenders now use angel shots to help bring awareness? I haven't heard about that. I can kind of imagine what you mean though. That seems like a really good idea. I would love to see like a link to that if you have it. That's cool.
Yeah.
I'm always glad when more areas of the community are engaging in that kind of conversation.
Well, and there's the, you mentioned code words earlier, right? But you call up your friend or your neighbor and you say, I'd like to order a pizza, right? And that's like the code word for, I have trouble going on, right? And come and save me, or come and get me or whatever. So yeah, I think that there's lots of these sort of kind of simple tactics that can be used to at least sort of immediately potentially remove somebody from a bad situation, right? And I believe on the angel shot thing, so it's when you ask a bartender for an angel shot that you're telling the bartender that you are in a bad situation.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking it was.
Yeah,
that's great. I'm glad
as somebody who doesn't go to bars very often, I'm a drinker at home, but if I remember, that's what it is. Yeah.
Glad that they're doing that. Yeah. So here, just last slide, just our helpline number. There's a national hotline number. That number will connect you to any organization in the country. I do know that in Pennsylvania, all shelters, all programs are required to serve people of all genders. How that's implemented varies by county, but they are required under PCADV, which is the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. they do all serve all genders. Again, varying degrees of implementation, but I know in Pennsylvania that that's true. There's a teen dating abuse text line too, if texting's better for you. And then there's some of my information if you ever want to reach out. I'm also happy to connect anybody to resources directly if they're more comfortable talking to a trans person specifically. I'm very happy to do that and serve that if that's something that anybody ever wants. And you can feel free to always reach out if you have more questions too.
Perfect.
Definitely.
Well, we will wait to see if anybody has any final comments or questions. We'll give people a couple moments, but Robin, I really appreciate you. This is such an important topic, and it's one that is not spoken of enough, right? Anywhere, but in particular in trans and non-binary communities, it's just there's so much else going on sometimes that we forget to think about these types of issues. And I really appreciate you bringing awareness to this. So thank you so much. I truly appreciate
for having me.
Yeah. So as a reminder, we will have this presentation available on our YouTube channel within a couple of days from today. And Robin, you said you were going to send a couple of links over to us. If you send those to me just in separate email, I'll make sure that those are linked in our YouTube.
Oh, that's great. That would be perfect. You can just put it, in like the comment, the under section.
Yeah.
Cool. I'll send those to you.
The video description. Yeah. So
cool.
It looks like we haven't got anybody else asking questions. So with that, I will just say thank you so much. Thanks for everybody who came out tonight to listen to what is definitely a challenging topic and for making the investment in your time. So thank you so much. Good night, everybody.